It was early April, and the sky was now clearing after heavy rain. The sun was down, and a cool, pale evening was quietly fading into night. Sam walked home under the early stars through Hobbiton and up the hill, whistling softly and thoughtfully. It was just at this time that Gandalf reappeared after his long absence. For 3 years after the party he'd been away. Then he paid Frodo a brief visit, and after taking a good look at him, he went off again. During the next year or two he had turned up fairly often, coming unexpectedly after dusk, and going off without warning before sunrise. He would not discuss his own business and journeys, and seemed chiefly interested in small news about Frodo's health and doings. Then, suddenly, his visits had ceased. It was over 9 years since Frodo had seen or heard of him, and he had begun to think that the wizard would never return, and had given up all interest in hobbits. But that evening, as Sam was walking home, and twilight was fading, there came the once familiar tap on the study window. Frodo welcomed his old friend with surprise and great delight. They looked hard at one another. "All well, eh?" said Gandalf. "You look the same as ever, Frodo." "So do you," Frodo replied. But secretly he thought that Gandalf looked older and more careworn. He pressed him for news of himself and of the wide world, and soon they were deep in talk, and they stayed up far into the night. Next morning, after a late breakfast, the wizard was sitting with Frodo by the open window of the study. A bright fire was on the hearth, but the sun was warm and the wind was in the south. Everything looked fresh, and the new green of spring was shimmering in the fields and on the tips of the trees' fingers. Gandalf was thinking of a spring, nearly 80 years before, when Bilbo had run out of Bag End without a handkerchief. His hair was perhaps whiter than it had been then, and his beard and eyebrows were perhaps longer, and his face more lined with care and wisdom. But his eyes were as bright as ever, and he smoked and blew smoke rings with the same vigour and delight. He was smoking now in silence, for Frodo was sitting still, deep in thought. Even in the light of morning he felt the dark shadow of the tidings that Gandalf had brought. At last he broke the silence. "Last night you began to tell me strange things about my ring, Gandalf," he said, "and then you stopped because you said that such matters were best left until daylight. Don't you think you had better finish now? You say the ring is dangerous. Far more dangerous than I guess. In what way?" "In many ways," answered the wizard. "It is far more powerful than I ever dared to think at first. So powerful that in the end it would utterly overcome anyone of mortal race who possessed it. It would possess him. In Eregion, long ago, many elven rings were made. Magic rings, as you call them, and they were, of course, of various kinds, some more potent and some less. The lesser rings were only essays in the craft before it was full grown, and to the elven smiths they were but trifles, yet still to my mind dangerous for mortals. But the great rings, the rings of power, they were perilous. A mortal, Frodo, who keeps one of the great rings, does not die, but he does not grow old or obtain more life. He merely continues, until at last every minute is a weariness. And if he often uses the ring to make himself invisible, he fades. He becomes in the end invisible permanently, and walks in the twilight under the eye of the dark power that rules the rings. Yes, sooner or later, if he is strong or well-meaning to begin with, but neither strength nor good purpose will last. Sooner or later the dark power will devour him." "How terrifying!" said Frodo. There was another long silence. The sound of Sam Gamgee cutting the lawn came in from the garden. "How long have you known this?" asked Frodo at length. "And how much did Bilbo know?" "Bilbo knew no more than he told you, I am sure," said Gandalf. "He would certainly never have passed on to you anything that he thought would be a danger, even though I promised to look after you. He thought the ring was very beautiful and very useful at need, and if anything was wrong or queer, it was himself. He said that it was growing on his mind, and he was always worrying about it, but he did not suspect that the ring itself was to blame, though he had found out that the thing needed looking after. It did not always seem of the same size or weight. It shrank or expanded in an odd way, and might suddenly slip off a finger where it had been tight." "Yes, he warned me of that in his last letter," said Frodo. "So I have always kept it on its chain." "Very wise," said Gandalf. "But as for his long life, Bilbo never connected it with the ring at all. He took all the credit for that to himself. and he was very proud of it, though he was getting restless and uneasy. Thin and stretched, he said, a sign that the ring was getting control.
"How long have you known all this?" asked Frodo again.
"Known?" said Gandalf. "I have known much that only the wise know, Frodo. But if you mean known about this ring, well, I still do not know, one might say. There is a last test to make, but I no longer doubt my guess." "When did I first begin to guess?" he mused, searching back in memory. "Let me see. It was the year that the White Council drove the Dark Power from Mirkwood, just before the Battle of 5 Armies, that Bilbo found his ring. A shadow fell on my heart then, though I did not know yet what I feared. I wondered how often Gollum came by a great ring, as plainly as it was. That, at least, was clear from the first. Then I hear Bilbo's strange story of how he had won it, and I could not believe it. When I at last got the truth out of him, I saw at once that he had been trying to put his claim to the ring beyond doubt, much like Gollum with his birthday present. The lies were too much alike for my comfort. Clearly the ring had an unwholesome power that set to work on its keeper at once. That was the first real warning I had that all was not well. I told Bilbo often that such rings were better left unused, but he resented it, and soon got angry. There was little else I could do. I could not take it from him without doing greater harm, and I had no right to do so anyway. I could only watch and wait. I might perhaps have consulted Saruman the White, but something always held me back."
"Who is he?" asked Frodo. "I've never heard of him before."
"Maybe not," answered Gandalf. "Hobbits are, or were, no concern of his. Yet he is great among the wise. He is the chief of my order, and the head of the council. His knowledge is deep, but his pride has grown with it, and he takes ill any meddling. The law of the elven rings, great and small, is his province. He has long studied it, seeking the lost secrets of their making. But when the rings were debated in the council, all that he would reveal to us of his ring lore told us against my fears. So my doubts slept, but uneasily. Still I watched and I waited. And all seemed well with Bilbo, and the years passed. Yes, they passed, and they seemed not to touch him. He showed no signs of age. The shadow fell on me again. But I said to myself, after all, he comes of a long-lived family on his mother's side. There is time yet. Wait. And I waited, until that night when he left this house. He said and did things then which filled me with a fear that no words of Saruman could allay. I knew at last that something dark and deadly was at work, and I have spent most of the years since then in finding out the truth of it."
"There wasn't any permanent harm done, was there?" asked Frodo anxiously. "He would get all right in time, wouldn't he? Be able to rest in peace, I mean?"
"He felt better at once," said Gandalf. "But there is only one power in this world that knows all about the rings and their effects, and as far as I know, there is no power in the world that knows all about hobbits. Among the wise, I am the only one that goes in for hobbit lore, an obscure branch of knowledge, but full of surprises. Soft as butter they can be, and yet sometimes as tough as old tree roots. I think it likely that some would resist the ring far longer than most of the wise would believe. I don't think you need worry about Bilbo. Of course, he possessed the ring for many years, and used it, so it might take a long while for the influence to wear off, before it was safe for him to see it again, for instance. Otherwise, he might live on for years quite happily, just stop as he was when he parted with it, for he gave it up in the end of his own accord, an important point. No, I was not troubled about dear Bilbo any more, once he had let the thing go. It is for you that I feel responsible. Ever since Bilbo left, I have been deeply concerned about you, and about all of these charming, absurd, helpless hobbits. It would be a grievous blow to the world if the dark power overcame the Shire. If all your kind, jolly, stupid Bolgers, horn-blowers, boffins, brace-girdles, and the rest, not to mention the ridiculous Bagginses, became enslaved. Frodo shuddered.
"But why should we be?" he asked. And why should he want such slaves?
To tell you the truth, replied Gandalf, I believe that hitherto, mark you, he has entirely overlooked the existence of hobbits. You should be thankful. But your safety has passed. He does not need you. He has many more useful servants, but he won't forget you again, and hobbits as miserable slaves would please him far more than hobbits happy and free. There is such a thing as malice and revenge.
Revenge? Said Frodo. Revenge for what? I still don't understand what all this has to do with Bilbo and myself and our ring.
It has everything to do with it, said Gandalf. You do not know the real peril yet, but you shall. I was not sure of it myself when I was last here, but the time has come to speak. Give me the ring for a moment.